Okay, so we've introduced, right, regularity theory of laws of nature as this sort of like more austere, less sort of spooky, metaphysically thick account of laws of nature. Now we've seen some problems with it. Now we're going to see some more problems with it, and we're going to come full circle, and Dretzy's going to argue that, like it or not, we have to believe in necessitarian laws, right? That's just the only way it's going to work. So he starts by talking about regularity theory, right? So he sort of reviews the argument for it, right? Which is like something like, look, we observe F's being G's. Again, like that's just sort of any regularity between sort of like properties in the world, right? So all objects with mass accelerate, right, towards the Earth at 9.81 meters per second squared, something like that. Any regularity, right? All electromagnetic waves travel at the speed of light, and so on. That's what he means by F's being G's. Um, he says the regularity theorist says, look, um, what we do is we observe F's being G's, right? And you're never going to get from that to any stronger claim than F's or G's, right? Um, trying to prove anything stronger would be like trying to prove that all bachelors are unmarried is somehow analytically true by just providing more examples of unmarried bachelors, right? Um, so maybe that's a little tricky to understand, right? So to say something is analytic is to say it's true, right? And by virtue of definition, right? It's not the sort of thing that's true by observing it, right? So he's saying regularity theorists say if you're trying to say that laws of nature are anything more than observed regularities, uh, how do you do that? What all we have is observations, right? Observations can only prove regularities, right? They can't prove anything stronger. They can't prove that something's true by definition, right? That's the point. Um, they would say it's just the wrong kind of evidence for that kind of claim, right? Um, and since observation is the only sort of evidence we have, then if we observe, right, that again, every object falls right towards the Earth at 9.81 meters per second squared, um, that's the only claim we can make. We can't make the additional claim that somehow it's necessary or must happen, right? It's just a description of what is. So again, this is just the regularity theory as Dretzy sort of describes it, as he thinks they argue for it. But Dretzy wants to say that that's one way you can define law, right? If you want to, and say laws are just regularities, but that's not how we typically think about laws, right? Um, and he demonstrates it by showing that real laws of nature are opaque. And what we mean by opaque in philosophy is that coextensive predicates. So all that means, it's a fancy word, it just means words, different words that pick out the same set of objects. Um, those are going to be interchangeable in just a universal statement, right? Which is what regularity theorists think laws of nature are. But they're not going to be interchangeable in a proper law. So it will help if I give you an example, right? I don't expect that to make sense quite yet. So for example, um, all diamonds have a refractive index of 2.419, right? Um, refractive index is just how, right, the degree to which it bends light, right? So all diamonds have a particular, and all substances have their own refractive index, right? So diamonds, refractive index of 2.419, right? So a coextensive predicate to diamond is all things mined in kimberlite. Why? Because diamonds are only mined in this particular mineral, kimberlite, right? So if I said, find me something that's mined in kimberlite, it'll be a diamond every time, right? They pick out the same set of objects. That's the point of a coextensive predicate. So um, all things mined in kimberlite have a refractive index of 2.419, not a law of nature. Why? What's the difference, right? They pick out the same regularity, right? They're in fact pick out the same set of objects, right? Uh, but it just happens sort of accidentally to be the case that the only things mined in kimberlite are diamonds. There's no lawful connection that we know of between where something is mined and its refractive index, right? So just because we find it in a particular mineral, that's no reason that we should be able to predict what sort of refractive index it would have, right? It's sort of accidental, right? So more generally, the idea is that laws are supposed to pick out regularities that happen for a reason, that explain something, right? Not just sort of accidental regularity. So that's the opacity, right? I can phrase the exact same thing in a way, two different ways. One way it comes out of law, another way it doesn't come out of law. So call this failure of substitution opacity, right? That's just the word we use for that thing, that you can't just trade out coextensive predicates. Um, Universal generalizations where you can make those sorts of substitutions we would call transparent, right? The opposite of opaque. Um, so the term opacity, if you have taken any other philosophy classes, you might have encountered it before. It's also used in another sense, like where we talk about beliefs being opaque, right? So the way that sort of opacity works is I can have a belief and I can switch out, right, one of the words for sort of a synonymous word for a coextensive predicate, and it changes the truth value of the statement. For example, Lois believes that Superman saved the day, right? That can be true, but it might not be true that Lois believes that Clark Kent saved the day, even though Superman is Clark Kent, right? Um, that's because of the nature of belief, right? I can know this guy under one sort of description, but not under the other, right? Um, so I just make this clarification. If you've never encountered this word opacity, then it doesn't matter, and you can sort of skip this slide. But if you have taken some philosophy and you know the word opacity and how it operates with belief, what Dresky's talking about is slightly different, right? So he's not talking about necessarily the truth value changing, right? If I say all things mined in kimberlite have this particular refractive index, that will be true, right? What changed is that it's no longer a law of nature, right? So it's opacity, but in a different sense. Okay, um, so regularity theorists will try to respond to this sort of problem, right? Um, by claiming that this opacity issue is not really a sort of a fundamental difference between laws and generalization, um, but just sort of a function of the way laws are used. So they think they can just add some sort of extra ingredient to the universal generalization to make it a law and rule out all this other stuff, right? These problems. So um, Dresky sort of gives you a menu of the sorts of things in the literature people have put forward as like what you need to add to true generalizations to then make them laws. And there'll be things like a high degree of confirmation or wide acceptance, right, by the scientific community, or explanatory potential, or deductive integration with a larger set of statements, right? So it features in a theory and it's got certain logical relations to the other part of the theory, right? Or its usefulness in prediction, right? So he's not going to get into the details of each of those ways that people have tried to supplement regularity theory uh, to make it rule out these sort of bad examples, like the diamond kimberlite thing. Um, he'll just say, okay, so here's what regularity theorists are up to. They think a law of nature is just sort of a universal truth, right? Some universal generalization plus some extra thing, right? Maybe one of those five. But what Dresky wants to argue is that this opacity problem um, is not an issue that can be solved so easily, right? He says it comes up because laws are just not the sorts of things that are claiming relationships between different sets of objects, right? All the things that happen to be diamonds and all the things that happen to have a refractive index of whatever, right? Um, he thinks the way we conceive of laws is not as relations between sets of objects. Instead, it's a relation between F-ness and G-ness. And by this, he means the property of being a diamond, right? The more abstract quality of diamondness and the property of having a certain refractive index, right? Um, this may feel like an odd distinction to make at first. We're edging into more metaphysically thick, weird territory, right? We're going to have to. Dresky's going to argue we can't get away with this sort of bare bones, right? Metaphysically very stark account. We're going to have to buy into some like a little more abstract and weird stuff. And one of the things we're going to have to get into is like, yeah, we have to believe there's like an essence of being a diamond, right? And an essence of having a certain refractive index. And he's going to say laws are relations between those essences, not relations between all the objects that happen to be diamonds and all the objects that happen to have that refractive index. So, for any object, right, here's why, right? He thinks that it has to be relations among properties, right, thought of as more abstract things than relations between any particular objects in the world, right? So there's lots of objects out there that are diamonds, right? And for any object that's a diamond, there's a lot of true things you can say about it, right? There's one that's owned by Nate, that's kept in a box, that's set in a ring, right? Um, those are all true things about it, but none of those are true just because it's a diamond, right? Compare that with the refractive index. That's true in virtue of its being a diamond, right? Um, it's because of its diamondness, of instantiating that property of diamondness. That's why it has the refractive index that it does, right? Um, and so he wants us to start talking about the property of diamondness independently of any particular diamond. So if, right, laws were just talking about groups of objects, then sure, you might be able to pick up the same group using various different properties, right? Um, so, for example, maybe I'm some super rich villain. I buy up every diamond in the world, right? Okay, then I could pick out all the diamonds in the world by saying everything that is in a box in Nate's secret vault, right? Um, but it shouldn't be a law of nature that everything in a box in Nate's secret vault has a refractive index of 2.419, right? Now, this part of this reason is why they talk about non-local, right? They restricted non-local predicates, right? Um, and we saw that that's still not going to work because you can still pick out local things using general terms, right? But in general, the idea is we don't care about all these. There's lots of properties of diamonds, right? There might be properties that of all the diamonds, right, that aren't the properties we care about, right? Um, so even if it just so happened that all diamonds in the world were like in a particular location, uh, that's not what we care about when we talk about diamondness and when we talk about its relation to, right, the refractive index. Um, having the property of diamondness doesn't entail anything about being in Nate's vault. Having the property of diamondness only entails certain things, and those are the relationships we care about for laws, right? And if you stick with those properties and the relations among those properties, you don't get the bad laws. All right, so the repair person came, so I've now teleported out of the car, and several days later, and I'm at home. And but I where we were then was basically just set up the necessitarian view, right, which is that laws of nature are relationships between properties, between the property of diamondness and the property of having a certain kind of refractive index. It's not about sets of objects that happen to be diamonds, right? There's lots of things we could say about the set of objects that happens to be diamonds that may or may not be relevant to the laws of nature, right? So that's the point there. And you, so we're going to talk about properties sometimes, we talk about universals sometimes. There's subtle differences that aren't super important, aren't could probably be super important for you unless you're writing a paper on that in particular. We'll sort of talk more about that distinction later. Um, but for now, we can just talk about things like diamondness, right? Just the property of being a diamond. Um, so, on this view of um, laws of nature entail universal generalizations about things that have properties, right? So, true that diamondness, right, entails if if all right, if diamondness and refractive index of 2.419 are related in this way, right? If those properties are related in a lawful way, that will entail that anything that is a diamond will have that refractive index, right? Um, but it's different, right? It's not a generalization about stuff that is diamonds, right? Which is what the regularity theory is. It's a generalization about, again, a relation between properties. And, now you may be thinking, what's the difference? What's these? We are essentially talking about like diamondness floating as a property that floats free of any particular thing that might be a diamond, right? Which might feel a little weird that it even makes sense to talk about properties on their own, right? Free of the objects in which they're instantiated. Um, and Betsy's going to have more to say about that later. It is a bit of the metaphysical weirdness that you're going to have to swallow, right? if we give up on regularity theory. Uh, so before we do that, or before we get into sort of what it means to be a free-floating property and what it means to have to believe in that those exist in some sense, um, Drutsky wants to sort of beat the dead horse of regularity theory and just there's no way this is going to work. Um, so even if it feels weird to talk about just properties on their own, once you realize how hopeless regularity theory is, you're going to be open to it. So let's talk a little more about that. So another problem for regularity theory of laws of nature is that proper law of nature ought to support counterfactuals, right? Um, but the simple universal generalizations that the regularity theorist wants to identify with laws do not support counterfactuals. So what do we mean by counterfactual? It's a claim about something that doesn't exist, right? But that could exist, right? So if I were the president of the United States, I would do this, right? Um, it's sort of a claim about stuff that doesn't exist, but you might still want to be able to say that's true or that's false, right? Um, oh, if I won the lottery, I would give all the money to charity, right? And you might say that's false, right? You might say that's a false statement, even though it's about something that right hasn't even really happened yet. So that's the idea. Uh, so, for example, um, for the regularity theorist, right? Let's suppose that every dog that's been born at sea is a cocker spaniel, right? Who knows, right? We don't know what dog's been born at sea, right? Let's say they've all been cocker spaniels so far, right? Just by whatever accident. Um, so for the regularity theorist, that would be a law, right? For all x, if x is born at sea, then x is a cocker spaniel, right? Well, that's not a law of nature, right? I could easily take a dachshund, right? Take a pregnant dachshund and bring it on a boat, right? And have baby dachshunds at sea. Uh, to take another example, right? Just because all of the marbles in a particular bag are red doesn't imply that if I were to put a marble in the bag, it would somehow become red, right? That's sort of what the regularity theorist is kind of committed to. If they're saying, or at least they're committed somehow saying laws of nature are like that, or laws of nature can't sort of capture that sort of thing, right? So just because all x's are y's currently so far in the world, right? That doesn't make it a law of nature that they always have to be, right? And we've encountered this before in the previous lectures, right? Um, suppose all ravens are black. That doesn't mean that they always have to be for all time, right? You could easily see, right, a group of ravens moving to the North Pole and eventually evolving to be white or whatever. Um, and and you'll recall those sort of plus X, right? So the regularity theorist has their list of like, here's what it takes to be a law, right? It's a universal generalization, a conditional format with non-local predicates, right? Blah, blah, blah. And then Drutsky said, and they all try to add another plus something, right? High degree of confirmation or whatever. Um, and none of those work for this problem of counterfactuals, right? So even if it were highly confirmed or accepted, right, widely accepted that all the marbles in a particular bag were red, it's not magically going to make a new blue marble that I put in the bag red, right? That's just not um, what we mean by sort of laws of nature. Another way that he tries to frame the difference, right, between generalizations, just true universal generalizations and laws, is looking at how we think about confirming a law, right? So I'm over 30, right? So I can increase the probability that the generalization everyone in this room is over 30 is true by just entering a room, right? Um, but that doesn't affect the probability that the very next person who enters the room is going to be over 30, right? So if laws are just universal generalizations, there's very sort of like trivial ways that you can confirm them, right? So I can walk into the room and I've added some degree of confirmation, right, to this law that everyone in this room is over 30. But again, it's a very useless kind of confirmation, right? It doesn't actually reveal any relationships in nature, right? About doesn't give us any reason for why the people in the room would be over 30, right? What you need is an explanatory hypothesis. So if the room is hosting a 20th high school reunion, all right, now we've got something more law-like, right? There is a relationship between the property of, right, being of 20th high school reunionness, right, and being full of people over 30ness, right? These um, properties are related in a lawful way, right? Um, so the point here is that laws are meant to explain the world, not just describe it, and that's revealed in the ways that we sort of seek out confirmation for our laws. So this is I think a helpful quote, right? So here, the fact that every F is G, and again, by F being G, I think I've um, if it's a object with mass of whatever, then it's going to be G, and G could be it's going to accelerate toward at a certain rate or something like that, right? Or if it's the raven, then it's going to be black, right? Any law-like relationship between having this property and having that property. So the fact that every F is G, right, which is what the regularity theorist cares about, okay, driving the world, um, that fact fails to explain why any F is G, right? And it fails to explain it not because its explanatory efforts are too feeble, right, to have attracted our children or attention, or if it need because it needs, extra like rules. That he says the explanatory attempt is not even made, right? When you're just describing the world, you're not even attempting to explain, right? So those kinds of regularity laws are not doing any explanation, not doing any explaining. Um, for example, the fact that all men are mortal does not explain why you and I are mortal, right? It says that we are mortal, but it does not even suggest why this might be so, right? So he's trying to really get at the heart of the difference between regularity theory and the necessitarian theory, and saying it's not that you need to add more conditions, right, to your regularity theory to rule out these bad cases. It's just not even trying to do what laws of nature are supposed to do, which is to explain why things are the way they are. And so, Dresky thinks that if you think about laws as relationships between properties, right, this solves all the problems. Right? The property of being a diamond is what entails the refractive index, right? Um, Not the property of where it was mined, right? Which, remember, you could pick out all the diamonds in the world by talking about objects mined in kimberlite, but that's not capturing what we care about relative to refractive index, right? The property of being a 20th high school reunion is what entails that a room is going to be full of people over 30. Um, the counterfactuals are supported now, right? So, for example, I can hold up just an ordinary rock and say, if this rock were a diamond, it would have a refractive index of 2.4. And that would make sense, right? Because again, that's the right type of law. That's what we want our laws to do. Um, it will not turn out to be a law that all dogs born at sea are cocker spaniels, right? Because there's just no connection between the property of being born at sea and the property of being a cocker spaniel. Um, and importantly, like none of this is these relations between these properties are not dependent on our investigation or what we know about the world, right? These properties and their relations exist, what we know about. He thinks of maybe so again, if he's convinced you that regularity theory is hopeless, right? It doesn't even start to get at the heart of what we want out of a law of nature, then you're going to have to go for necessitarianism, right? But the necessitarian theory says, yeah, you have to talk about properties as like things on their own, right? They're totally independent of whatever objects might have them. If that feels too weird for you, he says, look, think about it this way, right? Um, think about properties and their relations as like political offices set up by the Constitution or something like that, right? Um, it's not the particular person in the office that determines what roles they serve, how they behave, right? Um, the office itself is defined that way, and it places restrictions and obligations on whoever fills that office, right? So there's no logical necessity necessarily in having the offices set up the way they are, right? They could be set up different ways, right? It's not like logically required. Um, but given that setup, anyone who is in that office must behave in a certain way because of the nature of the office, right? So if it's necessitarian, right, in a certain sense, but not in the same way that math is, right? Not in the same way as 2 plus 2 equals 4. Whatever necessity is involved is sort of conditional on the nature of the office. So given that diamondness exists, right, and it is the way it is, then right that entails that anything that's a diamond will have a refractive index of 2.4. Was it 2.419, right? Um, so I don't know if that helps. It's a little metaphorical, right? Um, look, yeah, properties, they can be sort of independent of the objects and they place constraints. Anything that is a diamond, right, will have certain um, we will have certain properties, right, as certain associations, including a refractive index. Not everything that is a diamond has to be in my secret vault, right? Even if everyone happens to. So it's not a logical type of necessity that we're talking about with these offices and their relations or properties and their relations, but once we understand what it is to be a G, right, to be a diamond or whatever, and to be an F, to have a certain refractive index, then you can start to understand that if you're a diamond, you must have that refractive index, right? And we can even understand what it means to say, again, with the counterfactuals. If I were an F, then I would be a G, even if I'm not in fact an F, right? Um, Back to the offices, right? If I were the sheriff of Los Angeles County, I would be required to enforce the laws implemented by, right, the state legislature. Um, I'm not, right? But that counterfactual is still true, right? So, and the universal generalizations just can't capture that facet of the laws. They can only describe what is, right? Laws are a little stronger by moving up a level, talking about properties and their relations. The real laws of nature can tell us about what can happen, right? And again, making predictions is a big part of doing science. So this is why Dretske thinks laws explain and predict, right? Because they're relationships between universals, between properties, right? Not between groups of objects. Um, for example, he says the period of a pendulum decreases when we shorten the length of the bob, right? And the period is just sort of how long it goes back and forth. Um, Pendulums behave that way not because just they all do that, right? Which is sort of what the Humean regularity view is. It's just like, well, that's what constant conjunction. That's what we always seek, right? He says no, like the property, right, of having a certain length, right, and the property of having a certain period are related, right, and they're related in a precise way, and this equation here describes it. Right? Okay, so what the heck are diamondness, right? And Fness and genus in whatever form. I don't ever see diamondness floating around free. All I have ever seen is an object that happens to be a diamond, right? So um, this is, right, the thing you have to sort of swallow if you're going to become a necessitarian, right? That the regularity theorists were in part trying to avoid is that um, why do I need to believe in something called diamondness that exists independent of any particular diamond, right? And there's a lot of the literature in metaphysics is on this idea of like, what is the nature of universals, right? What is the number two? What is redness, and so on? Um, do they have to be some sort of abstract objects, or can we just explain them in terms of, just regular everyday objects? It's a big, complicated literature I'm not going to get into. But Dretske comes down firmly on one side and he says, yeah, there have to be universals, right? And it's an interesting approach to it, right? Because often in metaphysics, the stakes aren't very clear. Like, who cares if redness exists or not? Dretske here sort of like makes it pretty important, right? Because we would like science, right? Science is a big deal, right? It's made all of our lives a lot better. We all are going to live much longer, right? Because of science. Um, Science, right, uses laws, and so if we want to have, right, Dretske argues, proper scientific laws in the way we really think we need laws, laws that explain and predict. Um, we have to bite the bullet and say, yeah, universals, properties exist um, in sort of their own way, independently of whatever object happen to possess them. And so we want laws of nature, right? I think we do, right? And Dresky seems to argue, okay, then, just you believe in universals now too. So that is our little unit on philosophy of science. I just kind of focused in on one narrow area of laws of nature and just really the debate between regularity theorists and necessitarians. Um, I find it interesting. I don't know. I hope some of you do. If not, it's okay. Don't write a paper on it. Write it on something else. Right? Again, this course is a little sampler of different things. Um, so the next week, we'll be talking about reasoning and specifically decision theory. I think this is, I hope you can get past it's a little basic mathiness to it, but really nothing very difficult at all. And I include it because it's something so useful that you can use in your everyday life moving forward. Um, so I hope even though it's the end of probably summer section for you and you're writing your paper, I do hope you sort of like engage with this last week. I think it can really be